You think your money can fix everything, don't you? Well, it can't fix this. The words cut through the marble-walled boardroom like a blade, silencing 12 of Chicago's most powerful executives. But this wasn't about a failed merger or a hostile takeover. This was about love, the one thing billionaire Soren Llewellyn thought he'd never need again. The woman standing across from him wasn't wearing designer clothes or diamond jewelry. She wore scrubs from her job at a community clinic, her hands still bearing traces of the honest work that had first caught his attention. Amira Hassan had walked into his life as quietly as morning light, and now she was about to walk out of it forever. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "I won't be your weakness." But she already was. And for the first time in his 37 years, Soren Llewellyn, the man who controlled billion-dollar empires, was completely powerless. Welcome back to Millionaire CEO Love Stories, where we explore how the most unexpected connections can transform even the most guarded hearts. I'm your host, and today's story will challenge everything you think you know about love, class, and the courage it takes to choose your heart over your reputation. If you believe that true love can break down any barrier, no matter how high the walls or how deep the wounds, hit that like button right now. Your engagement helps this channel reach others who need to hear stories of hope and transformation. And don't forget to subscribe with notifications on, because you won't want to miss what happens next. This is the story of a man who built his fortune on cold calculations and emotional distance, and the woman whose simple smile brought his entire world crashing down. It's about discovering that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought, sold, or controlled. They can only be received with an open heart. Soren Llewellyn didn't believe in fairy tales. He believed in contracts, quarterly reports, and the brutal mathematics of profit and loss. Love, in his experience, was just another transaction that inevitably ended in betrayal. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, and he'd sworn never to forget it. But Amira Hassan wasn't looking for a fairy tale either. She was just trying to survive, working multiple jobs to pay for her father, his medical bills, while her own dreams of becoming a nurse gathered dust. When she took the housekeeping position at the Llewellyn estate, she had no idea she was walking into the life of a man who would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. He lived in a penthouse that overlooked Lake Michigan, where a single piece of art cost more than most people's annual salary. She lived in a studio apartment on the South Side, where she counted every dollar and still fell short at the end of each month. He was featured on the covers of business magazines as one of America's most ruthless deal makers. She was invisible to most of the world, just another working woman trying to make ends meet. But invisibility has a way of revealing truth, and truth has a way of changing everything. What started as a simple employment arrangement became something neither of them expected. A smile shared over morning coffee, a conversation during a power outage. Small moments that grew into something larger than either of them could control. This isn't just a love story, it's a story about courage. The courage to be vulnerable when you've been hurt before. The courage to see beyond surface differences to the person underneath. And the courage to fight for something real in a world that often values appearance over authenticity. So settle in, because you're about to witness a transformation that will remind you why love remains the most powerful force in the human experience. You'll see how a woman who cleaned floors taught a billionaire what it meant to be truly wealthy. And you'll discover that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet persistence of genuine care. Before we continue, I'd like you to take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. This helps us connect better. Welcome to the family. Now, back to where it all began. The alarm never sounded in Soren Llewellyn's penthouse. He woke naturally at 5:47 a.m. every morning, his internal clock calibrated by years of disciplined routine. The 42nd floor of the Willis Tower offered him a commanding view of Chicago's awakening skyline, but he rarely paused to appreciate it. Beauty was a luxury he'd trained himself not to need. His morning ritual was precise, methodical, 20 minutes on the Peloton bike positioned strategically to face the eastern windows. Shower temperature set to exactly 68 degrees. Coffee brewed from beans flown in weekly from a small plantation in Guatemala. Not because he particularly enjoyed the taste, but because consistency mattered in every aspect of his life. The penthouse itself was a monument to success and isolation. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that cost more than most people's homes. Every piece had been selected by an interior designer he'd never met, chosen for its investment value rather than comfort. The space felt more like a museum than a home, beautiful, impressive, and utterly devoid of warmth. By 6:30 a.m., Soren was dressed in one of his 30 identical Tom Ford suits, each tailored to perfection. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who looked younger than his 37 years, with sharp green eyes and dark hair that never seemed to fall out of place. Women found him attractive. He knew this from the way they looked at him at charity galas and business dinners. But attraction was just another form of transaction, and he'd learned long ago that everyone wanted something. His driver, Marcus, waited downstairs with the black Bentley Bentayga. They'd worked together for 8 years, and their relationship was built on mutual respect and minimal conversation. Marcus understood that mornings were for preparation, not small talk. "Good morning, Mr. Llewellyn," Marcus said, holding the door open. "Morning, Marcus." The usual route to the office. The drive through downtown Chicago took exactly 18 minutes, depending on traffic lights. Soren used this time to review overnight emails from his international offices. Llewellyn Capital operated across 4 continents, and money never slept. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from London, Tokyo, and Sydney. Each notification represented millions of dollars in potential profit or loss. The Llewellyn Capital building occupied an entire city block on LaSalle Street, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. Soren had purchased the building outright 3 years earlier, not because he needed the space, but because ownership meant control. He controlled the lease terms for every other tenant, controlled the security protocols, controlled who had access to his world. His private elevator whisked him directly to the 45th floor, where his corner office commanded views in 3 directions. The space was deliberately intimidating, a massive desk carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, chairs positioned to force visitors to look up at him, and walls lined with awards and photographs documenting his rise to power. At 8 a.m. sharp, his assistant Jennifer knocked and entered with his first coffee of the day and a leather portfolio containing the morning's priorities. Jennifer had worked for him for 6 years, and she understood his preferences better than he understood them himself. She was efficient, discreet, and maintained exactly the right amount of professional distance. "The Meridian Industries board meeting is confirmed for 9:30, she said, placing the portfolio on his desk. "Legal has finished reviewing the acquisition documents. The numbers look favorable for a hostile takeover if they reject our initial offer." Soren nodded, already scanning the financial projections. Meridian Industries was a family-owned manufacturing company that had been struggling for 2 years. Their debt-to-equity ratio made them vulnerable, and Soren had identified them as an ideal target for restructuring. He would strip away the inefficiencies, sell off the underperforming divisions, and emerge with a company worth 3 times his initial investment. The fact that this process would eliminate nearly 400 jobs was irrelevant. Business was about mathematics, not sentiment. The boardroom filled promptly at 9:30 a.m., with 12 of Chicago's most influential business leaders. These were men and women who controlled billions in assets, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives, who understood that power was the only currency that truly mattered. "Gentlemen, ladies," Soren began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legendary in financial circles. "Meridian Industries represents exactly the kind of opportunity we've been seeking. Their current leadership has proven incapable of adapting to market realities." He clicked through a presentation that laid out the acquisition strategy with surgical precision. Revenue projections, cost-cutting measures, timeline for implementation. Every slide was designed to demonstrate one thing: under his control, Meridian would become profitable within 18 months. "What about the workforce?" asked Margaret Chen, one of his longest-serving board members. "Redundancies are inevitable," Soren replied without hesitation. "We'll retain approximately 60% of current employees. The rest will receive standard severance packages." 400 families, Margaret pressed. 400 inefficiencies, Soren corrected. "Our responsibility is to our investors, not to preserving jobs that don't generate value." The room fell silent. This was the Soren Llewellyn they all knew. Brilliant, ruthless, and completely unmoved by emotional considerations. He had built his reputation on making the hard decisions that others couldn't stomach. By 11 a.m., the acquisition had been approved unanimously. Meridian Industries would receive an offer they couldn't refuse, and if they tried to refuse it anyway, Soren would simply buy enough of their debt to force a restructuring. Either way, he would win. As the board members filed out, discussing lunch plans and weekend golf games, Soren remained alone in the conference room. Through the windows, he could see the city spreading out below him, millions of people going about, their daily lives, unaware that decisions made in rooms like this one shaped their futures. He felt nothing. No satisfaction from the successful meeting, no anticipation for the profits to come. Success had become as routine as his morning coffee, as predictable as the sunrise over Lake Michigan. This was the life he had built for himself, controlled, profitable, and completely empty. The photograph sat in the bottom drawer of Soren's desk, buried beneath legal documents and quarterly reports. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years, but he knew exactly where it was, could feel its presence like a splinter beneath his skin. Some evenings, when the office grew quiet and the city lights began to flicker on below, his hand would drift toward that drawer before he caught himself and pulled away. Tonight was different. The Meridian acquisition had been finalized, the contract signed, and 400 termination letters would be delivered by morning. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like Tuesday. Soren opened the drawer and retrieved the photograph. The woman smiling back at him had honey blonde hair and laugh lines around her blue eyes. Elena Vasquez had been everything he thought he wanted: intelligent, ambitious, beautiful in the way that turned heads at restaurant entrances. She'd been a corporate attorney at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms, someone who understood his world and shared his drive for success. They'd met at a charity auction 5 years ago, bidding against each other for a weekend in Napa Valley. She'd won, then surprised him by suggesting they share the prize. Their relationship had unfolded with the same strategic precision they both applied to their careers: dinner dates at Michelin-starred restaurants, weekend getaways to carefully chosen destinations, public appearances that enhanced both their professional reputations. For 18 months, Soren had believed he'd found his perfect match. Elena never complained about his long hours or demanded emotional availability he couldn't provide. She had her own career, her own ambitions, her own carefully maintained independence. They were partners in the truest sense, two successful people who enhanced each other's lives without requiring messy emotional entanglements. The engagement had been logical, practical. They'd discussed it over dinner at Alinea, weighing the benefits like a business merger. Combined assets, shared social connections, the kind of power couple status that opened doors in their respective industries. Elena had said yes before he'd finished explaining his reasoning. Then his mother got sick. Margaret Llewellyn had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on a Thursday in October. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe 8, if she responded well to treatment. Soren had taken the news with his usual composure, immediately arranging for the best oncologists. The most advanced treatments, private rooms at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. What he hadn't anticipated was how watching his mother fade would affect him. Margaret had been the one constant in his life, the only person who'd loved him without agenda or expectation. She'd raised him alone after his father died in a construction accident when Soren was 12, working double shifts as a nurse to pay for his education. As the weeks passed and the treatments failed, Soren found himself spending more time at the hospital and less time maintaining the careful emotional distance that had served him so well. He held his mother's hand during chemotherapy sessions. He read to her when the pain medication made her too drowsy to focus. He allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of impending loss. Elena had been supportive at first, attending a few hospital visits and sending appropriate flowers. But as Soren's grief deepened and his availability decreased, her patience began to wear thin. She complained about canceled dinner plans, missed social events, his increasing emotional unavailability. "You're not the man I agreed to marry," she'd said during what would be their final conversation. "This version of you, this broken, needy version, isn't what I signed up for." Margaret died on a Tuesday in February, with Soren holding her hand and Elena nowhere to be found. She'd been at a networking event, building connections that would advance her career. When Soren called to tell her his mother was gone, Elena had expressed appropriate condolences and promised to attend the funeral. She'd broken their engagement 3 days later. "I need someone who can compartmentalize," she'd explained, returning the ring he'd spent 3 months selecting. "Someone who doesn't let personal tragedy interfere with professional obligations. You've become too emotional, too unpredictable. I can't build a life with someone I can't count on to maintain control." The betrayal had been surgical in its precision. Elena hadn't left him for another man, or because of some dramatic revelation. She'd left because grief had made him human, and humanity was a liability she couldn't afford. Soren had learned 2 crucial lessons from Elena's departure. First, that love was conditional, a contract that could be terminated when one party failed to meet expectations. Second, that emotional vulnerability was a weakness that would inevitably be exploited by those closest to you. He'd rebuilt himself accordingly. The man who emerged from that devastating period was harder, more calculating, completely immune to the kind of emotional manipulation that had nearly destroyed him. He dated occasionally, beautiful women who understood that dinner and expensive gifts were transactions, not promises. He attended social events when business required it, maintaining the kind of surface charm that kept doors open and opportunities flowing. But he never again allowed anyone close enough to hurt him. Love, he'd concluded, was a luxury he couldn't afford. The photograph felt heavier than it should in his hands. Elena looked so confident, so certain of her own desirability. She'd remarried within a year, a federal judge who could advance her political ambitions. Soren had seen the wedding announcement in the Tribune, complete with a glowing description of their perfect partnership. He wondered sometimes if she ever thought about him, if she ever regretted walking away when he'd needed her most. But those thoughts were unproductive, emotional indulgences that served no purpose. Soren placed the photograph back in the drawer and closed it firmly. The past was a closed book, its lessons learned and internalized. He'd built an empire on the foundation of that hard-won wisdom, surrounding himself with the kind of wealth and power that made him untouchable. Tomorrow would bring new deals, new opportunities, new victories that required nothing more than intelligence and determination. He would continue to succeed because he'd learned to need nothing from anyone. The city sparkled below his windows, millions of lights representing millions of lives he would never touch or be touched by. It was exactly the way he preferred it. Amira Hassan stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Llewellyn estate, clutching a manila folder containing her employment documents and trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. The mansion beyond the gates looked like something from a magazine, 3 stories of limestone and glass sprawling across manicured grounds that probably cost more to maintain than she'd earned in the past 2 years combined. The security guard emerged from his booth, clipboard in hand. "You must be the new housekeeper, Ms. Hassan?" "Yes, that's me." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Mr. Llewellyn's assistant will meet you at the main entrance. Follow the circular drive." The gates swung open with mechanical precision, and Amira walked up the cobblestone driveway, her worn sneakers silent against the perfectly maintained surface. She'd borrowed her sister's best interview outfit, a navy blazer that was slightly too big and black slacks that she'd hemmed herself the night before. It wasn't much, but it was clean and professional. The front door opened before she could knock. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes smiled warmly at her. "You must be Amira. I'm Mrs. Rodriguez, the head of household staff. Welcome to the Llewellyn estate." "Thank you. I'm grateful for this opportunity." Mrs. Rodriguez led her through a foyer that could have housed Amira's entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. Everything spoke of wealth so vast it was almost incomprehensible. "The estate has been in Mr. Llewellyn's family for 3 generations, Mrs. Rodriguez explained as they walked. "Though he's made extensive renovations since taking ownership, he has very specific preferences about how things should be maintained." They passed through a formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a living room furnished with pieces that belonged in a museum. Amira tried not to gawk, but it was impossible not to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of luxury surrounding her. "Your primary responsibilities will include the main living areas, Mr. Llewellyn. His private study and the guest suites," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "He's very particular about his morning routine, so those areas need to be pristine before he comes downstairs at 6:30. They climbed a sweeping staircase to the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Rodriguez showed her the supply closets, explained the cleaning schedules, and introduced her to the other staff members. There was James, the groundskeeper who'd worked here for 15 years, Maria, the cook who prepared meals with the precision of a restaurant chef, and David, the maintenance supervisor who kept the estate's complex systems running smoothly. Mr. Llewellyn values discretion above all else, Mrs. Rodriguez emphasized as they completed the tour. He's a very private person, and he expects his staff to respect those boundaries. No personal conversations, no questions about his business or personal life. You're here to do a job, and as long as you do it well, you'll find him to be a fair employer. Amira nodded, though she wondered what kind of life required such rigid boundaries between employer and employee. In her previous jobs, cleaning office buildings, working retail, serving tables at a diner, there had always been some level of human connection, even if it was just small talk about the weather. Your living quarters are in the staff wing, Mrs. Rodriguez said, leading her down a hallway lined with family portraits. It's modest, but comfortable. You'll have your own bathroom and kitchenette. The room was indeed modest compared to the grandeur of the main house, but it was larger and nicer than anywhere Amira had lived in years. A single bed with crisp white linens, a small desk by the window, a dresser, and a comfortable reading chair. The attached bathroom was spotless, and the kitchenette included a refrigerator, microwave, and coffee maker. This is wonderful, Amira said, setting her single suitcase on the bed. Thank you. Dinner is served in the staff dining room at 6. Breakfast starts at 5:30 for those who need to be working early. Mr. Llewellyn typically leaves for his office by 7 and returns around 8 in the evening, sometimes later. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Amira unpacked her few belongings and tried to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. 3 weeks ago, she'd been sleeping on her sister's couch, working 3-part-time jobs, and watching her savings disappear into her father's medical bills. The position at the Llewellyn estate offered steady income, free housing, and health insurance, luxuries she'd almost forgotten existed. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from their last phone conversation. Mija, you don't have to sacrifice your dreams for my illness. I've lived my life. You still have yours ahead of you. But dreams were expensive, and medical bills were immediate. Nursing school would have to wait. Again, at 5:15 the next morning, Amira was already dressed and ready to begin her first official day. She'd always been an early riser, a habit formed during years of juggling multiple jobs and responsibilities. The staff dining room was quiet except for James, who was reading a newspaper over coffee and toast. You're the new girl, he said without looking up. Word of advice, stay invisible. Mr. Llewellyn doesn't like disruptions to his routine. Amira poured herself coffee from the pot on the counter. What's he like? James finally looked at her, his weathered face serious. Fair but cold. Pays well, doesn't ask for anything unreasonable, but don't expect warmth or personal interest. He's got no use for people beyond what they can do for him. By 6 o'clock, Amira was in the main house, moving quietly through the living areas with her cleaning supplies. Everything was already immaculate. The previous housekeeper had maintained impossibly high standards, but she dusted, vacuumed, and polished until every surface gleamed. At exactly 6:30, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Amira quickly gathered her supplies and stepped into the hallway, pressing herself against the wall as a tall figure in an expensive suit descended toward the kitchen. Soren Llewellyn was younger than she'd expected, with dark hair and sharp features that belonged on magazine covers. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to owning everything around him. He didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't even glance in her direction as he passed. To him, she was invisible, just another piece of the machinery that kept his world running smoothly. Amira watched him disappear into the kitchen, then quietly returned to her work. She was here to clean, not to be noticed. But something about his complete indifference stung more than she'd expected. 3 weeks into Amira's employment, Soren's morning routine hit an unexpected disruption. His espresso machine, a $15,000 Italian masterpiece that had never failed him, chose that Tuesday morning to emit a grinding sound and produce something that resembled motor oil more than coffee. He stood in his kitchen at 6:45 a.m., already running 15 minutes behind schedule, staring at the malfunctioning machine with the kind of frustration usually reserved for failed business deals. His driver would arrive in 10 minutes, and Soren Llewellyn was never late, never unprepared, never thrown off balance by something as mundane as broken appliances. "Excuse me, Mr. Llewellyn?" The voice was soft, hesitant. He turned to find his housekeeper standing in the doorway, holding a cleaning cloth and looking uncertain about whether she should have spoken at all. "What is it?" His tone was sharper than necessary, irritation bleeding through his usual composure. "I couldn't help but notice the coffee machine seems to be having trouble. There's a regular coffee maker in the staff kitchen if you'd like me to bring you a cup. It's not espresso, but it's good coffee." Soren's first instinct was to decline. He didn't drink regular coffee. He had standards, preferences, a carefully calibrated morning routine that didn't include accepting help from the household staff. But his phone was already buzzing with messages from his assistant, and the alternative was arriving at the office without caffeine, a scenario that would affect his entire day. "Fine. Black, no sugar." Amira nodded and disappeared, returning within minutes with a steaming mug. The coffee was indeed good, rich, smooth, with a warmth that his expensive espresso machine somehow never quite achieved. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd thanked anyone for something so simple? "You're welcome." She turned to leave, then paused. "I hope your day gets better from here." That's when it happened. She smiled. Not the practiced, calculated smile he was accustomed to from business associates and social acquaintances. Not the flirtatious smile of women who wanted something from him. This was different, genuine, warm, completely without agenda. It reached her eyes, creating small crinkles at the corners, and for a moment, it transformed her entire face. Soren felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation so unexpected he nearly dropped the coffee mug. The smile lasted maybe 3 seconds before she turned and walked away, humming softly to herself as she continued her morning routine. He stood frozen in his kitchen, staring at the empty doorway where she'd been, trying to process what had just happened. It was just a smile. People smiled at him all the time, but this felt different, and he couldn't understand why. The drive to his office passed in unusual silence. Marcus made his customary greeting, but Soren barely responded, his mind replaying those 3 seconds over and over. There had been something in her expression, a kindness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and authentic, offered freely without expectation of return. His assistant Jennifer noticed his distraction immediately. "Is everything all right, Mr. Llewellyn? You seem different this morning." The coffee machine broke. Minor inconvenience. But it wasn't the machine that had unsettled him. It was the realization that in 3 weeks of living in the same house, he'd never really looked at his housekeeper. She'd been background noise, invisible labor that kept his world functioning smoothly. He knew her name only because it appeared on payroll documents. Now, suddenly, he found himself curious. What had made her smile so naturally? What was she humming? Why did she seem genuinely happy to help, even when he'd been unnecessarily brusque? That evening, Soren found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than usual, ostensibly reviewing documents, but actually listening for sounds of activity from other parts of the house. He could hear voices from the staff dining room, laughter, conversation, the kind of easy human connection that had been absent from his life for years. Through the service window, he caught glimpses of Amira interacting with the other staff members. She was animated, engaged, asking Maria about her grandchildren and listening with genuine interest to James's stories about his weekend fishing trips. There was something magnetic about her presence. She drew people in, made them feel heard and valued. "She's good for morale," Mrs. Rodriguez said, appearing beside him with a stack of linens. "The staff has been happier since she arrived. She has a gift for making people feel appreciated." Soren nodded absently, still watching through the window. Amira was helping Maria clear dishes, moving with efficient grace while maintaining a steady stream of conversation. She laughed at something David said, the sound carrying clearly across the space, rich, unguarded, infectious. When had he last laughed like that? When had he last felt the kind of uncomplicated joy that seemed to radiate from her so effortlessly? "Mr. Llewellyn?" Mrs. Rodriguez was looking at him with concern. "Are you feeling well?" "Fine. Just tired." But he wasn't tired. He was confused, unsettled by the growing awareness that something was missing from his carefully constructed life. Something he'd convinced himself he didn't need, didn't want. couldn't afford to risk again. The next morning, his espresso machine was working perfectly. David had repaired it the previous evening. But when Soren reached for his usual cup, he hesitated. The regular coffee had been good, better than good, actually, and there had been something appealing about the simple human interaction that came with accepting help. He found himself walking toward the staff kitchen, telling himself he was just checking on the household operations. Amira was there, preparing her own breakfast before beginning her daily routine. "Good morning, Mr. Llewellyn. Is everything all right? The coffee yesterday was excellent. I was wondering, what brand do you use?" She looked surprised by the question, then pleased. "It's just a local roaster on the south side. Nothing fancy, but they care about quality. My father introduced me to them years ago." "Your father has good taste." "Had," she corrected gently. "He passed away last month." The words hit Soren unexpectedly hard. He recognized the particular quality of grief in her voice, fresh, raw, but carried with dignity. It was the same tone he'd heard in his own voice after his mother died. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." He would have liked knowing his coffee recommendation reached someone who appreciates quality. She smiled again, smaller this time, touched with sadness, but still genuine. Still warm. And Soren felt that same inexplicable shift in his chest. Stronger now, impossible to ignore. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything? A single interaction that made you question assumptions you'd held for years? Sometimes transformation begins with the smallest gestures, a cup of coffee offered without expectation, a smile given freely, a moment of human connection that reminds us what we've been missing. Over the following weeks, Soren found himself making excuses to venture into areas of the house he'd previously ignored. A forgotten file in the library, a need to check the thermostat in the main hallway, sudden interest in the condition of the guest rooms that hadn't been used in months. Each excuse brought him into contact with Amira's daily routine, and each encounter revealed new layers to the woman he'd initially dismissed as invisible help. She worked with a quiet efficiency that impressed him, but it was her small acts of kindness that truly caught his attention. He watched her leave fresh water bowls outside for the stray cats that wandered onto the estate grounds, despite knowing that James disapproved of encouraging them. She always carried treats in her apron pocket, not expensive ones, just simple crackers she'd saved from her own meals. "They're just hungry," he overheard her explaining to Maria one afternoon. "Everyone deserves to eat." The comment stayed with him longer than it should have. When was the last time he'd considered hunger, real hunger, not the manufactured appetite that came with skipping lunch during a long meeting? When had he last thought about deserving anything beyond what he could buy or negotiate? Amira's reading habits fascinated him most of all. During her breaks, she could always be found with a book tucked under her arm or spread open on her lap. Not romance novels or celebrity magazines, but serious literature. Toni Morrison, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Maya Angelou. Books that required thought, engagement, emotional investment. One evening, he found her in the library during her dinner break, curled up in one of the leather chairs with a worn copy of Beloved. She was so absorbed in the story that she didn't notice him enter. Her face reflecting the emotions of whatever passage she was reading. "Heavy reading for a dinner break," he said, immediately regretting the comment when she startled and nearly dropped the book. "I'm sorry, Mr. Llewellyn. I didn't realize you needed the library. I can leave." "No, stay. I was just curious about your choice of literature." She looked down at the book in her hands, then back at him, with something that might have been defiance. "I know it's not what you'd expect from someone in my position. What I expect is irrelevant. What interests me is why you choose books that challenge rather than entertain." The question seemed to surprise her. She considered it carefully before answering, as if no one had ever asked her opinion about anything that mattered. "Because easy books don't teach you anything about yourself. They don't make you grow. I figure if I'm going to spend my free time reading, I might as well come away changed by the experience." The honesty of her answer hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd read anything that wasn't directly related to business? When had he last sought out an experience that might change him rather than simply confirm what he already knew? And what has Morrison taught you? That pain doesn't have to define you, but it will always be part of your story. That love can survive things that should destroy it. That healing is possible, even when you think you're too broken to fix. She spoke with the conviction of someone who'd lived those lessons, not just read about them. Soren found himself wanting to ask what pain she'd survived, what healing she'd experienced. But the questions felt too intimate for their carefully maintained professional distance. "I should let you get back to your reading," he said instead. "Actually," she said, then hesitated. "Would you like to borrow it when I'm finished? I'd be curious to know what you think." The offer was simple, innocent, but it felt like something more, an invitation to share thoughts, perspectives, the kind of intellectual intimacy he'd avoided for years. "I'd like that," he heard himself say. Her smile in response was radiant, transforming her entire face with genuine pleasure. "I'll leave it on your desk when I'm done." That night, Soren lay awake thinking about their conversation. There was an intelligence in Amira that had nothing to do with formal education or professional credentials. She thought deeply, felt deeply, engaged with the world in ways that his wealth and status had insulated him from. The next morning, he found himself arriving downstairs earlier than usual, hoping to encounter her during her morning routine. She was in the dining room, carefully arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase, not because it was required, but because she believed beautiful spaces lifted people's spirits. "Good morning, Mr. Llewellyn. You're up early today. Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind. Work troubles?" The question was asked with genuine concern, not idle curiosity. It occurred to him that no one had asked about his well-being in months, not his assistant, not his business associates, certainly not the women he occasionally dated. Everyone assumed that wealth equaled happiness, that success meant satisfaction, not work, just thinking. She nodded as if she understood the weight that thoughts could carry. "My father used to say that the mind is like a garden. If you don't tend it carefully, weeds will grow where flowers should be." Wise man. He was. He only had an 8th grade education, but he understood people better than anyone I've ever met. He could see past what someone showed the world to who they really were underneath. "And what do you see when you look at people?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, more personal than anything he'd intended to ask. Amira studied his face for a long moment, her dark eyes serious and thoughtful. "I see someone who's forgotten how to be happy," she said quietly. "Someone who's built walls so high that even he can't see over them anymore." The observation was gentle but devastating in its accuracy. Soren felt exposed, seen in a way that made him want to retreat to the safety of his office, his routines, his carefully controlled world. Instead, he found himself asking, "And do you think those walls can come down?" "I think walls are built by people, which means people can tear them down, but only if they want to badly enough." She finished arranging the flowers and stepped back to admire her work. The simple gesture had transformed the formal dining room into something warmer, more welcoming. "I should start on the upstairs rooms," she said, gathering her supplies. "Have a good day, Mr. Llewellyn." As she walked away, Soren realized that something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. She was no longer invisible to him, hadn't been for weeks. More troubling, he was beginning to suspect that he was no longer invisible to her either. The walls he'd spent years building were developing cracks, and Amira Hassan was the earthquake causing them to crumble. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday evening in late October, rolling off Lake Michigan with the fury of nature unleashed. By 8 o'clock, rain was hammering against the estate's windows like bullets, and wind howled through the trees with enough force to bend century-old oaks nearly horizontal. Soren was in his study, reviewing acquisition documents by lamplight, when the power flickered once, twice, then died completely. The house plunged into darkness so absolute, it felt like being swallowed by the earth itself. Emergency lighting kicked in within seconds, casting eerie shadows throughout the mansion, but the main electrical systems remained dead. Soren reached for his phone to call the utility company, then remembered that storms like this typically meant hours without power, possibly longer. He was making his way toward the kitchen to check on the backup generator when he heard voices from the main hallway. Mrs. Rodriguez coordinating with David about emergency protocols, Maria securing the kitchen, James checking the grounds for damage. But it was another voice that caught his attention, calm and reassuring despite the chaos outside. "The security system has a battery backup, but we should reset the main panel to make sure everything's functioning properly," Amira was saying. "I worked at a hotel before this. We had to deal with power outages regularly. Soren found her in the main foyer with David, both of them examining the security control panel by flashlight. She'd changed out of her usual work clothes into jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Without the formal distance of her uniform, she looked younger, more approachable. "Do you know how to reset the system?" David asked, clearly impressed by her knowledge. "The basics. Each panel is different, but the principles are usually the same." She noticed Soren approaching and straightened slightly. "Mr. Llewellyn, I'm sorry about the disruption. We're just making sure the security systems are functioning properly. You seem to know what you're doing. I've had experience with emergency situations. You learn to stay calm and focus on what needs to be done." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the foyer in stark white light for a split second, before plunging them back into the warm glow of emergency lighting. Thunder followed immediately, so loud it seemed to shake the foundation of the house. "That was close," David muttered, checking his radio for updates from the utility company. "The storm's supposed to last most of the night," Amira said, consulting her phone. "But the house is solid. We'll be fine." Her confidence was infectious, and Soren found himself oddly comforted by her presence. Most of the women in his social circle would have been demanding immediate solutions, complaining about the inconvenience, or fleeing to hotels with backup power. Amira simply accepted the situation and focused on making the best of it. "I should check on the staff," Mrs. Rodriguez said, appearing with her own flashlight. "Make sure everyone's comfortable." "I'll help," Amira offered immediately. "Actually," Soren heard himself say, "could you stay for a moment? I wanted to ask you about the security protocols." It was a transparent excuse, and from the look David gave him, not a particularly convincing one. But Amira nodded, waiting until the others had dispersed before turning her attention back to him. "What did you want to know about the security system?" "Nothing, actually. He paused, unsure how to explain the sudden reluctance to be alone with his thoughts in the darkness. "Would you like some coffee? I have a gas stove in the kitchen." She looked surprised by the invitation, then pleased. "That sounds nice." The kitchen felt different in the dim emergency lighting, less formal, more intimate. Soren found himself moving with uncharacteristic uncertainty as he prepared coffee, hyper-aware of Amira's presence as she settled into one of the breakfast nook chairs. "You're not what I expected," he said, handing her a steaming mug. "What did you expect? Someone temporary, someone who would do the job and move on without making an impression. And instead?" He sat across from her, studying her face in the soft light. "Instead, I find myself curious about things that shouldn't matter to me. Like why you read Morrison instead of romance novels. Why you feed stray cats. Why you seem genuinely happy despite circumstances that would make most people bitter." Amira wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, considering his words. "You want to know why I'm not bitter?" "Yes. Because bitterness is a choice. Pain happens to you, but bitterness is something you do to yourself. I've had enough real problems without creating emotional ones." "What kind of real problems?" The question was more personal than anything he'd asked before, crossing boundaries they'd both carefully maintained. But something about the storm, the darkness, the intimacy of shared coffee in an empty kitchen made normal rules feel suspended. "My father was sick for 3 years before he died. Cancer. I dropped out of nursing school to take care of him, worked multiple jobs to pay for treatments that didn't work, watched the strongest man I knew become weak and afraid. Lost him anyway." Her voice remained steady, but Soren could hear the grief underneath. Not fresh anymore, but permanent, woven into the fabric of who she was. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was, but it also taught me what actually matters. Time with people you love, small kindnesses, the difference between wanting things and needing them." She looked at him directly. "What about you? What taught you to build walls?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him directly about his emotional defenses, and certainly no one had done it with such gentle directness. "Betrayal," he said simply, "learning that love is conditional, that people leave when things get difficult. Not all people. Enough people. So you decided it was safer to need no one." "Safer, yes. More efficient. Less complicated. Less human." The words weren't accusatory, just observational, but they hit him like a physical blow. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, And in that moment of illumination he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, not pity, but understanding. Recognition. "You think I'm broken?" he said. "I think you're scared. There's a difference. And what do you think I'm scared of?" The same thing everyone's scared of. Being seen for who you really are and rejected anyway. The honesty of her answer left him speechless. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, but inside the kitchen, surrounded by emergency lighting and the warmth of shared coffee, Soren felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt safe enough to be vulnerable, and that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Amira was polishing the banister in the main hallway. Soren heard her voice change from its usual warm tone to something strained and frightened, and despite his policy of not eavesdropping on staff conversations, he found himself pausing at the top of the stairs. "Are you certain about the test results?" she was saying, her free hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles had gone white. But he was doing so well after the surgery. The doctors said they got everything. Soren felt his stomach drop. He'd lost his own mother to cancer, and he recognized the particular quality of devastation in Amira's voice, the sound of hope being systematically destroyed by medical terminology. "I understand. Yes, I'll be there this afternoon. Tell him I love him." She ended the call and stood motionless for a long moment, staring at her phone as if it might ring again with better news. When she finally looked up, she saw Soren watching from the landing above. "I'm sorry, Mr. Llewellyn. I know personal calls aren't supposed to happen during work hours. It won't happen again. What's wrong?" The question surprised them both. Soren never asked personal questions, never involved himself in staff problems, never crossed the professional boundaries he'd established so carefully. "It's nothing that affects my work. I can handle it." "That wasn't what I asked." Amira's composure cracked slightly. "My father's cancer has returned. The doctors want to start aggressive treatment immediately, but..." She stopped, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "But what?" "But the insurance won't cover the experimental therapy they're recommending, and without it, they're giving him 6 months. Soren descended the stairs slowly, his mind already calculating costs and solutions. "What's the name of his oncologist?" "Mr. Llewellyn, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." "What's the doctor's name?" "Dr. Patricia Reeves at Northwestern Memorial. But the treatment costs over $200,000. I could never repay that kind of money." "Who said anything about repayment?" The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to examine. Amira stared at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process what he was suggesting. "Why would you do that for someone you barely know?" The honest answer was too complicated, too revealing. Because watching her suffer reminded him of his own helplessness when his mother was dying. Because her father had raised a daughter who fed stray cats and read Morrison and smiled with genuine warmth. Because somewhere in the past few weeks, her well-being had become important to him in ways he didn't understand. "Because I can," he said instead. "And because no one should lose their father to something that money can fix." Tears spilled down her cheeks then, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me help." She nodded, unable to speak, and Soren felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of using his wealth for something that actually mattered. Within 2 hours he'd spoken directly with Dr. Reeves, arranged for the experimental treatment to begin immediately, and ensured that Hassan Ahmed would receive the best possible care. The money was transferred before lunch, a sum that represented less than he'd spent on his last vacation but meant the difference between life and death for Amira's father. That evening she found him in his study, where he was pretending to review contracts, while actually wondering if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. "Mr. Llewellyn?" She knocked softly on the doorframe. "May I come in?" "Of course." She entered carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like homemade cookies. "I wanted to thank you properly. And I thought you might like some coffee. I made it the way you prefer." She set the tray on his desk, and as she reached for the coffee pot, her hand brushed against his. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it sent an electric shock through his entire system. She felt it too. He could tell from the way she froze, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at him. Neither of them moved away. "Amira," he said quietly, her name feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. Yes, I need you to know something. What I did today, helping your father, it wasn't charity. It wasn't some noble gesture from a wealthy man feeling generous. Then what was it? He looked at her hand, still touching his, and made a decision that would change everything. It was selfish. I helped him because I couldn't stand the thought of you being in pain, because somewhere along the way, your happiness became important to me. More important than it should be. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Mr. Llewellyn, Soren. My name is Soren. Soren, she repeated, and the sound of his name in her voice made his heart race. I need you to know that I never expected this. I never planned on feeling. Feeling what? Feeling like this job became something more than work, like this house became home, like you became. She paused, searching for words. Like you became someone I look forward to seeing every morning. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and completely inappropriate given their circumstances. Soren knew he should step back, re-establish professional boundaries, pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, he turned his hand palm up and intertwined their fingers. I never planned on feeling this way either, he admitted. I built my entire life around not feeling this way. But you, he shook his head, amazed by his own honesty. You make me want to tear down every wall I've ever built. They stood like that for a long moment, hands joined, the weight of their mutual confession settling around them like a shared secret. Outside, the city sparkled with evening lights, but inside his study, the only thing that mattered was the warmth of her touch and the courage it had taken for both of them to speak the truth. This complicates things, Amira said softly. Everything worthwhile is complicated. I work for you. That can change. People will talk. People always talk. She smiled then, the same radiant expression that had first caught his attention weeks ago, but now it was meant specifically for him. What are we doing, Soren? I have no idea, he admitted. But I don't want to stop. Neither did she. And in that moment, both of them understood that they'd crossed a line from which there would be no return. The shift in their relationship was subtle at first, marked by stolen glances and conversations that lasted longer than necessary. Soren found himself creating reasons to be in whatever room Amira was cleaning, and she began timing her breaks to coincide with his movements through the house. Their first shared meal happened by accident. Soren had been working late in his study, when hunger finally drove him to the kitchen at nearly 10 o'clock. He expected to find the space empty, but instead discovered Amira sitting at the breakfast nook with a simple dinner of soup and bread, a book propped open beside her plate. I'm sorry, she said, starting to gather her things. I didn't realize you needed the kitchen. Stay, he said, surprising himself with the request. I was just looking for something simple. Don't let me interrupt your dinner. He prepared a sandwich, while she continued reading, both of them hyper-aware of the other's presence. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt companionable, domestic in a way that his sterile penthouse had never achieved. What are you reading tonight? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. She held up the book, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. You mentioned wanting to discuss her work after you finished, beloved. Which I still haven't started, he admitted. Work has been consuming. It always is, isn't it? Work, I mean. There's always another deal, another meeting, another crisis that demands immediate attention. Her observation wasn't critical, just thoughtful, but it made him pause. When was the last time he'd read for pleasure? When had he last done anything that wasn't directly related to increasing his wealth or expanding his influence? What would you do, he asked, if money wasn't a consideration, if you could pursue any path without worrying about practical concerns? Amira set down her spoon, considering the question seriously. I'd finish nursing school, work in pediatric oncology maybe, help families navigate the kind of crisis my father and I went through. Why pediatric oncology specifically? Because children shouldn't have to be brave. They should get to be scared and angry and confused, and there should be adults around them who can handle that without falling apart. She paused. What about you? If you could start over, what would you choose? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him about alternative paths, different dreams. His trajectory had seemed inevitable from the moment he'd graduated, from Wharton. Business, success, accumulation of wealth and power. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been focused on building this empire for so long, I'm not sure I remember what I wanted before it became about winning. There must have been something, a childhood dream maybe. He thought back to his youth, before his father's death had forced him to grow up too quickly. I wanted to be an architect. I used to spend hours drawing buildings, designing spaces where people could live and work and feel happy. That's beautiful. Do you still draw? No. Haven't touched a pencil for anything creative in 20 years. That's a shame. The world needs more beautiful spaces. Their conversation continued past midnight, ranging from books to dreams, to the small observations about life that people rarely share. Soren found himself revealing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, while Amira offered perspectives that challenged assumptions he'd held for years. These late-night encounters became routine. Soren would work late, knowing she often stayed up reading after her shift ended. She would prepare enough dinner for two, never asking if he wanted to join her but always leaving space at the table. They discussed everything, her childhood in a working-class neighborhood where community mattered. More than individual success, his isolation in boarding schools where achievement was the only currency that counted. She told him about her father's wisdom, the way he'd taught her to find joy in small things. He shared memories of his mother, the nurse who'd worked double shifts to give him opportunities she'd never had. She would have liked you, he said one evening, the admission slipping out before he could stop it. What makes you say that? She believed in the power of kindness, said was the only thing that could heal the world's wounds. You remind me of her in that way. Amira reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. She was. I wish I'd been more like her. You are more like her than you think. What you did for my father, that was pure kindness. During the day, they maintained professional distance, but the undercurrent of intimacy was impossible to hide completely. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed the way Soren lingered in rooms where Amira was working. Maria observed how Amira's face lit up when he entered the kitchen. James commented on the boss's improved mood, his increased patience with staff requests. Something's different about Mr. Llewellyn, David mentioned during a staff meeting. He actually asked about my daughter's soccer game yesterday. In 6 years, he's never asked about my family. People change, Mrs. Rodriguez said diplomatically, but her knowing look in Amira, as direction suggested, she understood exactly what was causing the transformation. The book exchanges became their secret language. Soren left volumes of poetry on her desk. Pablo Neruda, Rumi, Mary Oliver. She responded with novels that explored themes of connection and transformation. Each book came with handwritten notes in the margins, creating an ongoing conversation that felt more intimate than any physical touch. One evening, she found a first edition of 100 Years of Solitude on her nightstand, along with a note, for someone who understands that magic exists in everyday moments. Thank you for reminding me to see it. Her response came the next morning, a collection of essays by James Baldwin, with her own note, for someone brave enough to examine his own heart. The world needs more people willing to do the hard work of becoming human. The weight of their different social positions pressed on them constantly. Amira was acutely aware that she was falling in love with a man whose world she could never truly belong to. Soren struggled with the knowledge that pursuing her could destroy the career she was trying to rebuild and expose her to scrutiny she didn't deserve. This is dangerous, she said one night as they sat in his study, sharing wine and conversation while rain drummed against the windows. I know. People will assume I'm using you, that I'm some kind of gold digger who seduced her wealthy employer. I know. Your business associates will question your judgment. Your social circle will ostracize you. I know. She studied his face in the lamplight. And you're willing to risk all of that? Soren set down his wine glass and looked at her directly. Amira, I've spent 15 years building a fortune that can't buy me a single moment of genuine happiness. I've surrounded myself with people who see me as a transaction, not a person. I've lived in emotional isolation so complete that I'd forgotten what it felt like to actually connect with another human being. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The ability to feel joy in simple things, to see beauty in everyday moments. to believe that I might be worth loving for who I am, not what I own. Soren, I'm willing to risk everything because without you, everything I have is meaningless anyway. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and completely life-changing. Outside, the storm continued, but inside his study, surrounded by books and soft light and the warmth of shared understanding, they both knew they'd reached a point of no return. The secret moments were no longer enough. Soon, they would have to decide whether their connection was worth fighting for in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The photograph appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune's gossip section on a Wednesday morning, grainy but unmistakable. Soren and Amira walking together through Lincoln Park, her hand briefly touching his arm as they paused beside the lake. The headline, read, "Billionaire's Secret Romance, Llewellyn Capital CEO Spotted with Mysterious Woman." Soren's phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. Jennifer's voice was tight with barely controlled panic when he answered. "Mr. Llewellyn, we have a situation. The Tribune, the Sun-Times, and 3 financial blogs have picked up the story. My phone hasn't stopped ringing since 5:30. He was already pulling up the article on his tablet, his stomach sinking as he read the speculation about Amira's identity, her background, the Cinderella story angle that reporters love to exploit. Have they identified her yet? Not by name, but they're digging. Someone leaked that she works at your estate. It's only a matter of time before they have her full background." Soren closed his eyes, imagining Amira's reaction when she discovered that their private moment had been turned into public entertainment. They'd been so careful, so discreet, but apparently not careful enough. Schedule an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. And Jennifer, no comment to any media requests. Refer them to legal. Already done. But sir, Margaret Chen called personally. She's concerned about the optics. Margaret Chen had been his mentor when he'd first started Llewellyn Capital, one of the few people whose opinion he genuinely respected. If she was concerned, the situation was worse than he'd thought. Amira was in the kitchen when he found her, mechanically preparing breakfast, while tears streamed down her face. She looked up when he entered, her expression a mixture of devastation and resignation. "I saw the paper," she said quietly. "Mrs. Rodriguez showed me before I could hear it from someone else. Amira, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be exposed to this. They're calling me your mystery woman. Like I'm some kind of secret you're ashamed of." The pain in her voice cut through him like a blade. "You know that's not true, do I? Because right now it feels like I'm exactly what they're saying, the help who forgot her place. Don't say that. Don't let them make you feel small." She laughed bitterly. "I don't need them to make me feel small, Soren. I am small. I clean houses for a living. I dropped out of school. I have nothing to offer someone like you except—" "Stop." His voice was sharper than he'd intended. "Don't you dare diminish yourself because some gossip columnist needs a story." But the damage was done. He could see it in her eyes. The doubt, the shame, the growing certainty that their connection had been a fantasy that couldn't survive contact with reality. The board meeting that afternoon was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy and barely veiled threats. 12 of Chicago's most powerful business leaders sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Margaret Chen spoke first, her voice carefully neutral. "Soren, we need to discuss the potential impact of this morning's news. Coverage on Llewellyn Capital's reputation and business relationships." "What impact?" Soren asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Meridian Industries deal is being reconsidered," said Robert Walsh, the board's longest-serving member. "Their family values are apparently incompatible with what they're calling your inappropriate workplace relationship. The Henderson Foundation is pulling their investment," added Patricia Morrison. "They're concerned about your judgment and decision-making capabilities, and the Chicago Business Council is questioning whether you should continue as their chairman," Margaret finished. "The optics are challenging." Soren looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people who'd celebrated his successes and profited from his decisions. Now they were treating him like a liability to be managed. "Let me understand this correctly," he said slowly. "You're suggesting that my personal relationships should be subject to board approval?" "We're suggesting," Robert said carefully, "that as the public face of this company, your personal choices affect all of us. Your shareholders, your employees, your business partners. And what exactly are you recommending?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Margaret spoke. Distance yourself from the situation. Quietly. Let the story die down. Find a more appropriate companion for public events. You want me to end my relationship because it's bad for business? We want you to consider the broader implications of your choices, Patricia said. This woman, whatever her qualities, comes from a different world. The media will never let that go. Every business dinner, every charity gala, every public appearance will become a spectacle. She'll be scrutinized, criticized, held to impossible standards, Robert added. Is that fair to her? Is it fair to the company? The arguments were logical, practical, exactly the kind of cost-benefit analysis that had guided every major decision in his life. But for the first time, Soren found himself rejecting the mathematics of success in favor of something more fundamental. No, he said quietly. No? Margaret looked surprised. No, I won't end my relationship to protect the company's image. No, I won't sacrifice my personal happiness for shareholder approval. And no, I won't pretend that a woman's worth is determined by her bank account or social status. The room erupted in concerned murmurs and whispered conversations. Robert leaned forward, his expression grave. Soren, you're not thinking clearly. This infatuation is not an infatuation. It's love. And it's the first genuine emotion I've felt in 15 years of building this empire. Love doesn't pay dividends, Patricia said bluntly. Neither does loneliness. Neither does the kind of hollow success that leaves you empty at the end of every day. Margaret tried a different approach. What about her? Have you considered what this exposure will do to her life? The scrutiny, the judgment, the constant speculation about her motives? The question hit its mark because Soren had been thinking about exactly that. Amira didn't deserve to have her privacy invaded, her character questioned, her every move analyzed by strangers, who would never see her as anything more than a gold digger who'd seduced her wealthy employer. I've considered it, he said finally, and I'll let her make that choice for herself. But even as he spoke the words, Soren wondered if the choice had already been made for both of them. The world had intruded on their private sanctuary, and he wasn't sure their connection was strong enough to survive the harsh light of public scrutiny. By the time he returned home that evening, Amira had made her decision. Her resignation letter was waiting on his desk, along with the key to her room and a note that would haunt him for weeks to come. Some walls exist for good reasons. I won't be the one to tear down everything you've built. Thank you for showing me what love could feel like, even if we can't have it. She was gone, and Soren was alone again in his fortress of wealth and isolation. The silence in the Llewellyn estate was deafening. For 2 weeks, Soren moved through rooms that felt like a mausoleum, each space echoing with memories of conversations that would never happen again. The breakfast nook where they'd shared late-night meals sat empty. The library where she'd curled up with Morrison novels felt hollow and purposeless. Even his study, once his sanctuary, now reminded him only of the evening she'd touched his hand and changed everything. Mrs. Rodriguez had tried to maintain normalcy, hiring a replacement housekeeper within days of Amira's departure. The new woman was efficient, experienced, and completely invisible, exactly what Soren had thought he wanted. But her presence only highlighted what was missing. No humming while she worked. No books tucked under her arm. No genuine smiles that could transform an ordinary morning into something worth experiencing. She's very qualified, Mrs. Rodriguez had said diplomatically when Soren asked about the replacement. 20 years of experience with high-profile clients. And she's not Amira. The simple statement had hit him like a physical blow, confirming what he'd been trying to deny for 14 days. This wasn't about missing good help or convenient companionship. This was about losing the only person who'd seen past his wealth to the man underneath, who'd challenged him to be better while accepting him exactly as he was. Soren's work suffered in ways that shocked his colleagues. He missed meetings, forgot important calls, and found himself staring out windows instead of reviewing contracts. The Meridian Industries deal collapsed completely when he failed to return their attorney's calls for 3 consecutive days. 2 major investors pulled their funding, citing concerns about his erratic behavior and questionable judgment. You're destroying everything you've built, Jennifer warned during one of their increasingly tense morning briefings. The board is talking about a vote of no confidence. Margaret Chen called twice yesterday asking if you need medical attention. Maybe I do, Soren replied. surprising them both with his honesty. "Sir, maybe I need help figuring out why none of this matters anymore. Why success feels like failure when you have no one to share it with." Jennifer studied his face with genuine concern. "Mr. Llewellyn, if this is about the woman from the newspaper, her name is Amira. And yes, this is about her. This is about the fact that I let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away because I was too much of a coward to fight for what mattered." That evening, Soren sat in his study holding Amira's resignation letter for the 100th time, reading words that had been burned into his memory. "Dear Mr. Llewellyn, I am submitting my resignation effective immediately. I understand that my presence has become a liability to your business and reputation. I never intended to cause problems, and I certainly never intended to fall in love with someone whose world I could never truly belong to. Thank you for your kindness to my father and for showing me what it feels like to be seen and valued. I will treasure our conversations and the brief time when I felt like I mattered to someone extraordinary. Please don't try to find me. Some distances are too great to bridge, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. With gratitude and love, Amira." The formal tone couldn't hide the pain underneath, and Soren knew he was responsible for every word of hurt she'd tried so carefully to conceal. She'd left to protect him, sacrificing her own happiness to preserve his reputation and business interests. She'd made the noble choice, the selfless choice, the choice that proved exactly why she was worth fighting for. But he'd let her go without a fight. He'd sat in that boardroom and listened to 12 people reduce the woman he loved to a public relations problem, and he'd done nothing to defend her. Worse, he'd allowed their concerns to plant seeds of doubt in his own mind. What if they were right? What if loving her would destroy everything he'd built? What if the scrutiny became too much for her to bear? What if their different backgrounds made a real relationship impossible? The questions had paralyzed him for 2 weeks, but now, sitting alone in his empty mansion, Soren finally understood the answers. He didn't care if loving her cost him every business deal. He didn't care if society disapproved or if his social circle ostracized him. He didn't care if the board voted him out or if his empire crumbled around him. Because what was the point of having everything if you had no one to share it with? What was the value of success that required you to sacrifice love? What kind of life was worth living if it meant abandoning the person who made you want to be better? Soren picked up his phone and called his private investigator, a man he'd used for background checks on potential business partners. "I need you to find someone," he said without preamble. "Amira Hassan. She worked for me until 2 weeks ago. I need to know where she is, where she's working, how she's doing. Any particular reason for the search? I need to apologize, and then I need to ask her to marry me." The investigator's report arrived the next morning. Amira was working at a community health clinic on the south side, the same neighborhood where she'd grown up. She was living in a studio apartment above a bakery, taking night classes to finish her nursing degree, and volunteering at a homeless shelter on weekends. She was rebuilding her life with the same quiet determination she'd brought to everything else, creating meaning and purpose without wealth or status or any of the advantages he'd taken for granted. The report included a photograph taken outside the clinic, Amira in scrubs, her hair pulled back, in a practical ponytail, smiling at an elderly patient she was helping into a wheelchair. She looked tired but content, purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with money or recognition. Looking at that photograph, Soren made a decision that would either save his life or destroy it completely. He was going to fight for her. He was going to prove that love was worth more than reputation, that connection mattered more than control, that some things were too precious to sacrifice for the approval of people who would never understand what they'd shared. But first, he had to find the courage to face the woman he'd failed and convince her that he was finally ready to choose love over fear. What would you sacrifice for love? Your reputation? Your career? The approval of everyone around you? Sometimes the most important battles are fought not for what we want to gain, but for what we refuse to lose. The Southside Community Health Clinic occupied a converted warehouse on Halsted Street, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. Soren sat in his Bentley across the street for 20 minutes, watching people flow in and out of the building. Elderly, residents with walkers, young mothers carrying babies, teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This was Amira's world. Not the marble halls and crystal chandeliers of his estate, but a place where health care was a right, not a privilege, where people came when they had nowhere else to turn. He'd traded his usual Tom Ford suit for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but he still felt conspicuously out of place. The Bentley alone probably cost more than the clinic's annual budget. Everything about his presence here screamed wealth and privilege in a neighborhood where both were scarce. At 3:47 p.m., he saw her. Amira emerged from the clinic's main entrance, wearing scrubs and carrying a worn leather bag. She looked tired but purposeful, stopping to help an elderly man navigate the front steps before continuing toward the bus stop. Soren's heart hammered against his ribs as he crossed the street. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, not the polished beauty of his social circle, but something deeper, more authentic. She radiated the kind of inner strength that came from choosing service over self-interest, purpose over profit. Amira. She turned at the sound of her name, and her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, pain, and finally, resignation. Soren, what are you doing here? I came to apologize, and to ask you to come home. I am home. She gestured toward the clinic, the neighborhood, the life she'd built without him. This is where I belong. You belong with me. The words hung between them, honest and desperate, and completely inadequate for everything he needed to say. People walked past them on the sidewalk, but Soren was aware only of Amira's dark eyes studying his face, as if trying to solve a puzzle. You let me go, she said quietly. When the newspapers made me a scandal, when your board questioned your judgment, you let me walk away without a fight. I was wrong. You were protecting your empire. I understand that. I even respect it. But I won't be someone you turn to when it's convenient and abandon when it's not. Her words cut deep because they were true. He had chosen his reputation over their relationship, had allowed fear to override love when courage was required. You're right. I failed you when you needed me most. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving without you. Soren, I love you. The declaration stopped her mid-sentence. I love your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you see beauty in ordinary moments and find joy in helping others. I love that you read Morrison and feed stray cats and make me want to be a better man. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't speak. I love you, he continued, and I'm tired of pretending that anything else matters more than that. Before she could respond, his phone rang. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen, and something in her tone when he answered told him this wasn't a routine call. Mr. Llewellyn, where are you? The board has called an emergency meeting. They're voting on your removal as CEO in 1 hour. Soren looked at Amira, who had heard every word. Tell them I'll be there. Sir, they're serious this time. Margaret Chen says if you don't distance yourself from this situation immediately, they'll have no choice but to act. I understand. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He ended the call and found Amira watching him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. You have to go, she said. Your company needs you. Come with me. What? Come with me to the board meeting. Let me show them, let me show everyone, that you're not a scandal or a liability. You're the woman I love, and I'm proud to stand beside you. Soren, that's career suicide. They'll destroy you. Then let them. I'd rather lose everything and have you than keep everything and lose myself. The boardroom was electric with tension when Soren arrived. Amira's hand clasped firmly in his. 12 faces turned toward them, expressions ranging from shock to outright disapproval. Margaret Chen's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a warning. Soren, Robert Walsh said, his voice tight with controlled anger. We specifically asked you to distance yourself from this situation, and I specifically declined to do so. Then you leave us no choice. Margaret stood, her expression pained but resolute. The board has voted. Unless you end this relationship immediately and publicly, we will remove you as CEO of Llewellyn Capital. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Soren felt Amira's hand tighten in his, felt her preparing to let go, to sacrifice herself once again for his benefit. He wouldn't let her. You think your money can fix everything, don't you? Amira said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the marble-walled room. Well, it can't fix this. The words, the same ones that had opened this story, silenced the room completely. But now Soren understood their true meaning. She wasn't talking about his wealth's inability to solve problems. She was talking about its inability to create genuine connection, real love, Authentic happiness. You're right, Soren said, looking directly at her. Money can't fix this. Money can't create what we have. Money can't buy the way you make me feel or replace what I'd lose if I let you go again. He turned to face the board, his voice steady and certain. I resign. The words dropped like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock throughout the room. Soren, don't be hasty, Margaret began. I'm not being hasty. I'm being honest. For the first time in 15 years, I'm choosing what matters over what pays. I'm choosing love over fear, connection over control, happiness over hollow success. He looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people who'd shaped his career and shared his victories. I built this company to prove I was worth something, but the only person who ever made me feel truly valuable is standing right here beside me. So keep the company, keep the reputation, keep the empire. I'm choosing her. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Amira spoke, her voice soft but clear. And I'm choosing him. 6 months later, Soren stood in the kitchen of their modest 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, making coffee the way Amira had taught him, with patience, attention, and genuine care for the process, rather than just the result. The morning sun streamed through windows that faced east, illuminating a space that cost less per month than he used to spend on wine, but felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. You're up early, Amira said, emerging from the bedroom in scrubs, her hair pulled back for another shift at the clinic. She'd been accepted into an accelerated nursing program at Northwestern, and between classes and clinical rotations, her days were packed from dawn to dusk. Couldn't sleep. Too excited about today. She smiled, the same radiant expression that had first captured his attention, but now it was meant exclusively for him. The groundbreaking ceremony. The Hassan Llewellyn Community Health Center would break ground that afternoon on a lot 3 blocks from where they'd first reunited. Soren had liquidated most of his personal assets to fund the project. A state-of-the-art medical facility that would provide free healthcare to underserved communities throughout Chicago's South Side. It wasn't charity. It was investment in the kind of world he wanted to live in, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. Your father would be proud, Soren said, handing her a travel mug of coffee. He would be amazed. A health center named after our family? He never could have imagined something like that. Hassan Ahmed had lived to see his daughter's engagement, had walked her down the aisle at their small ceremony in Millennium Park, and had passed peacefully in his sleep 2 months later. His final words to Soren had been simple: take care of my girl. She's stronger than she knows, but everyone needs someone to lean on. The transition from billionaire CEO to community advocate hadn't been easy. The financial press had covered his resignation with a mixture of shock and speculation. Some called it a breakdown, others a midlife crisis. A few perceptive journalists recognized it for what it was: a man choosing authentic happiness over artificial success. Soren had kept enough assets to ensure their security, but the vast majority of his wealth now funded the health center, a scholarship program for first-generation college students, and a foundation that provided interest-free loans to small businesses in underserved communities. Any regrets? Amira asked, a question she posed periodically, as if she still couldn't quite believe he'd chosen this life over his former empire. Only one, he said, pulling her close. I regret waiting so long to find you. She laughed, standing on her toes to kiss him. You didn't find me. I found you. Remember? I was the one who brought you coffee when your fancy machine broke. Best malfunction of my life. The apartment they shared was a far cry from the Llewellyn estate. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers. No staff to maintain perfection. No rooms that felt more like museums than living spaces. Instead, they had mismatched furniture from thrift stores, books stacked on every available surface, and a kitchen table where they shared meals and conversations that lasted for hours. Soren had discovered the joy of cooking, of creating something with his hands rather than simply purchasing the results of others' labor. Amira had taught him to find satisfaction in small accomplishments: a perfectly prepared meal, a book. That changed his perspective, a conversation that deepened their understanding of each other. I have to go, she said, checking her watch. Mrs. Patterson is coming in for her diabetes check, and she specifically requested me. Because you actually listen to her stories about her grandchildren. Because I care about her as a person, not just a patient. It was a distinction that had taken Soren months to fully understand. In his former life, people had been transactions, useful or not useful, profitable or not profitable. Amira had taught him to see individuals, to value connection over utility, to find meaning in service rather than accumulation. The groundbreaking ceremony that afternoon drew a crowd that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. Community leaders, local residents, former patients from the clinic, and even a few of Soren's former business associates who'd come to witness his transformation. Margaret Chen approached him as he stood reviewing his speech notes. "Soren, you look happy." "I am happy, Margaret. Genuinely, completely happy. I owe you an apology. The board was wrong to force that ultimatum. We were so focused on protecting the company that we forgot about protecting the person who built it. You were doing what you thought was right. I don't hold any grudges. Llewellyn Capital isn't the same without you. We're profitable, but we've lost something essential. The vision, the passion, the sense that we were building something meaningful." Soren looked across the crowd to where Amira was talking with a group of nursing students, her face animated as she described the center's planned pediatric wing. "I found something more meaningful," he said simply. When it came time for speeches, Soren stood before the microphone and looked out at faces that represented the community he'd chosen to serve. No teleprompter, no carefully crafted corporate messaging, just honest words. From a man who'd learned the difference between success and significance. "A year ago, I thought I had everything," he began. "I had wealth, power, influence, and the respect of my peers. I also had the emptiest life imaginable." He found Amira in the crowd, her eyes bright with pride and love. "Someone very wise once told me that walls are built by people, which means people can tear them down, but only if they want to badly enough. Today, we're not just breaking ground for a new building. We're tearing down the walls that separate us from each other, that divide communities, that make healthcare a privilege instead of a right." The applause was warm, genuine, filled with the kind of appreciation that money couldn't buy. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Soren and Amira stood together looking at the empty lot that would soon house their shared dream. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how different my life would be if your smile hadn't brought me to my knees. And I'm grateful for every moment that led us here, every mistake, every wrong turn, every wall I built that you helped me tear down." She leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "I love you, Soren Llewellyn. I love you too, Amira Hassan Llewellyn." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had become their home, planning a future built not on wealth or status, but on love, service, and the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived. Sometimes the greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate, but what you're willing to give away for something more valuable than money could ever buy. And that's how a billionaire who swore never to love again found himself brought to his knees by a maid's smile, not because she conquered him, but because she freed him. Soren Llewellyn learned what so many of us forget in our pursuit of success, that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, sold, or negotiated. They can only be received with an open heart and nurtured with genuine care. Love didn't make him weak. It made him brave enough to choose authenticity over approval, connection over control, and purpose over profit. Amira didn't save him from his loneliness. She showed him that he was worth saving himself. Their story reminds us that transformation is always possible, no matter how high the walls we've built or how deep the wounds we carry. Sometimes it takes just one person, one genuine smile, one moment of authentic connection to remind us who we really are beneath all the armor we wear. The Hassan Llewellyn Community Health Center now serves over 15,000 patients annually, providing free healthcare to families who would otherwise go without. Soren and Amira's foundation has funded scholarships for 300 first-generation college students and provided startup capital for dozens of small businesses in underserved communities. But their greatest achievement isn't measured in dollars or statistics. It's measured in the quiet satisfaction of lives lived with purpose, love shared without conditions, and the daily choice to see each other, really see each other, beyond the roles society assigns us. Soren still wakes up early every morning, but now it's to make coffee for the woman he loves, to read the newspaper together at their kitchen table, to plan their day around service rather than profit. He's traded his penthouse for a modest apartment, his Bentley for public transportation, his empire for a partnership built on equality and mutual respect. And he's never been happier. Amira graduated from nursing school with honors, and now works as a pediatric oncology nurse at Northwestern Memorial, the same hospital where Soren's mother once worked double shifts to provide for her son. She helps families navigate the same crisis she and her father faced, offering not just medical care, but the kind of compassionate presence that makes unbearable situations slightly more bearable. She's found her calling, and in doing so, she's helped Soren find his. Their love story isn't a fairy tale where the prince rescues the servant girl. It's something more powerful, a story of two people who rescued each other from lives that looked successful on the surface but felt empty underneath. They didn't complete each other, they challenged each other to become more complete versions of themselves. The world tried to tell them that their love was impossible, that their different backgrounds made a real relationship unworkable, that society's rules were more important than their heart's truth. They proved the world wrong by refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose on them. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that love isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing life. It's about being willing to build a new life together, one that honors both of your dreams and creates space for both of your authentic selves. Now I want to hear from you because every love story, including yours, matters. Have you ever met someone whose presence changed everything for you? Someone who saw past your defenses to the person you really are? Someone who made you want to tear down walls you'd spent years building? Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about the moment when someone's smile, kindness, or simple humanity reminded you what connection really feels like. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Maybe you're like Soren was, successful on paper but empty inside, surrounded by people who see your achievements but not your heart. Maybe you're like Amira, working hard, staying strong, but wondering if anyone will ever truly see and value who you are beneath your circumstances. If that's you, I want you to know that your story isn't over, that the walls you've built for protection can become bridges to connection, that the right person won't be intimidated by your success or put off by your struggles. They'll see the real you and choose to stay. Love like Soren and Amira's doesn't happen every day, but it happens more often than we think. It happens when we're brave enough to be vulnerable, wise enough to see past surface differences, and strong enough to choose connection over comfort. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that authentic love is worth fighting for, show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us reach others who need to hear stories of hope, transformation, and the courage to choose love over fear. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful love story that conquers not through force, but through the quiet persistence of genuine care. And share this video with someone who still believes in real love, someone who needs to be reminded that the most beautiful relationships often begin in the most unexpected places, because sometimes all it takes is one smile to change everything. Until next time, keep your heart open. You never know who might be waiting to see the real you.